Pastor. That's too much compliment for me. Try to be a pastor like that, respect, and just need to go. But thank you so much for your support and encouragement. As you can probably tell, nervous. Uh, I would call it a double portion of nervous because I'm preaching this morning and I also have a parent rotation this afternoon. Not that that's a skidding. Try to keep myself calm and stay focused on what God has to say. It's been over a year. I stepped up as a youth pastor, and I am so grateful for our students, our parents, our volunteers, and who's serving for youth and for our church. That really makes a big difference, a lot to me and to my family, to ours as well. So I want to say thank you so much. So I think last has been very busy, and especially the summer was really busy. But it's summer. After our youth mission trips and conference, our family went on a family trip to the mountains in Colorado. Our very first family trip on a plane. And my kids are still young, so if you ever travel with the little ones, and you like very challenging, and I felt like it was an extension of summer. But my kids are still young. He's 4, he's 2, so they are still young. So we hike very high the mountain, but you can see that my wife Eunice, Hannah, and Lynn. But we were to enjoy the beauty of God's creation. It was beautiful my first time there. It was so beautiful. But like Hannah, Haley, they fall asleep. We're hiking, so I had to carry them around. And people passing by, they just like, poor that something. I said, okay, we're not coming for the 3 years until they walk by themselves. So while we were walking, actually, a 4-year-old daughter, and she said something that really caught my attention. It was her first time there as well, right? And she said, Daddy. Well, she only speaks Korean, so she said, Daddy. I think there's a difference between what God made and what people made. And I asked, what do you mean? She said, what God is life, but people made is not. Like the mountains are alive, fish, cows, birds, and trees are alive, but airplanes, hotels, and cars are not alive. So I was so amazed. That is absolutely right. I never thought about it before, and I learned that she way smarter than her dad. The Lord. And then in this world, there are things that are alive and things that are not alive. And sometimes things that look alive but really are alive. And our faith can be like that. There is a faith is alive, and there's a faith that is not alive. Live faith trusts God, to God in the darkest moments, but that faith only works in the sunshine. And the faith that is a alive kind of faith that presses into God in the times there. But the faith that is not alive only functions when life is smooth and problem-free. Today in our passage from 2 Kings chapter 4, we see the story of a widow whose faith was living faith. And through her faith and times of despair, God revealed His power and His blessings. So we're going to read this passage together, 2 Kings 4, 1 through 7. It's not long, so we're going to read all together with one voice. The wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried, your servant is dead, and you know he revealed the Lord. Now his creditor is come to take us as his slaves. Elisha replied to her, how may I help you? What have in your hands? Your servant has nothing there at all, except a small jar of olive oil. Elijah said, go around and ask all neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside and shut behind you and yours pour oil into all jars. And as each is filled, put it to one side. She came and shut the door behind her and her sons. They brought the jars and kept pouring. When all jars were full, she said to her, bring me another one. They replied, there is not a jar. Oil stopped flowing. She went and told the man of God, and he said, go sell the oil and pay that. You and your sons keep on what is. And all God's people say, Amen. Amen. So let's verify before we move on. So this is a story of Elisha, not Elijah. I know the name sounds similar, but in Hebrew context, the original Elijah in Hebrew it's Eliyahu. Eliyahu means my God is Yahweh. My God is Yahweh. On the other hand, Elisha in Hebrew is Elisha. My God is salvation. So it's confusing, so don't feel bad if you mix them up. But Elijah was here, and Elisha was his student. And Elijah, who was taken up into heaven in a chariot, Elisha was a disciple who picked up Elijah's mantle and on the ministry. In today's passage, we meet this widow who has lost her husband, who has just lost her. Her husband was a man who feared the Lord, who feared one of the disciples, prophet Elisha. And to put it in today's terms, I think him as seminaries preparing for ministry and training to serve God, but living with very little. But after his death, all his debt fell on shoulders, and the Christian demanding payment. If she could not pay, they threatened to take her 2 sons slaves. So verse 1, it says this, the wife of a man from the company of the prophets cried out to Elisha, my husband is dead, and you know that he revealed the word. But now his creditor is coming to take my boys as his slave. So we don't know he ended up leaving so much debt, but because of it, creditors were threatening to take her 2 sons as slaves to pay it off. And in those days, this was not unusual. And if a person could pay their debts, then the creditors had the legal right to take the debtor or their children as slaves. So in fact, this practice was the law, and there was this agreement between creditor and debtor. And in some cases, of course, a close relative had been as a redeemer. Does that sound familiar? To buy them back. And we see a similar story in the story of Ruth and Boaz. It's not this exact situation, but similar situation whereby step as a redeemer. But in this widow situation, there was none. Family member to step in from this situation. Nowhere else to turn. She went to the prophet Elisha for nowhere else to turn. But she cried out. In the English Bible it says cried out, but when you look at the original word, it does not mean she politely for help. It's not what it means. It means she screamed, wailed, and she cried out. That's what it. So it was the cry of a mother who had nowhere else to turn but God. And when I picture this, I can't help myself in that situation. So what if something happened to me and my wife was left with all my debt? I don't have much, but I do have some. And let's imagine that she way to pay it back. And the creditors are coming to take daughters, Hannah and him, as slaves. And I honestly cannot even begin to imagine it. Word desperate does not almost to capturing the way of that kind of situation. Here is this widow in despair, hopeless, powerless, yet she goes to Elisha. Ultimately, it means she to God. And you might think that, of course, situation would cry out to God and go and ask God for help. But if you think about it one more time, then it's not so simple. Her husband had served the Lord faithfully, a seminary student, ministry all day long, feared God, followed the prophet, and yet he still. And after she was dead, abandoned, wasting the loss of her children. Would everyone in the situation still run God? And would everyone in the situation still trust God? Honestly, I think not everyone, but instead it would be easy to become bitter, easier to feel abandoned, easier to give up on faith and hope. But this widow had nothing with her, but her faith led her to God. Even in her despair, she sought God. And that is where the miracle begins. So she had faith that God first, even in times of despair. Why? She believed that God is the only refuge, her help, and her prayer. And the psalmist in Psalm 46, 1-3. God is refuge and strength, an ever-present help in trouble. Therefore we will not fear. The earth give away, and the heart of the sea, though its water roll and foam, and the mountains quit their stream, we will not fear. That's a powerful reminder. It's a powerful reminder. God is the one who never falls asleep, never forgets us. He is laid at our right hand, and the one who is our king and go. No matter what seasons we find ourselves in, this truth does not change because God alone is our refuge. Verse 2 said, "How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? What do you have in your house?" So he's not asking a question because he had known about her situation, but Elisha, he knew about her situation. But he's asking this question to draw out her faith, So let's talk about this prophet Elisha. So Elisha, he was a prophet, major prophet in the nation, from front kings and country. And he was used by God for great and dramatic events, and for the entire nation. So Elisha was like up there. And yet he was also the prophet who shared a small personal struggle, one grieving widow, just one widow. He the heart of God, carried the heart of God, not the powerful, but for powerful, and not just for a nation, but for neighbors. And through this story, we see the of God for the lowly, the overlooked, people, society, all counts. And as you already know, in that culture, children were the most valuable, and among them, those had the lowest standing at all. And yet, Elisha attention to her, and care and note with her. And this is the heart of God, of the downward to the low places, a compassion that bends down to lift up the broken. At this point of the story, it's easy to think that Elisha is simply the instrument that God used to perform this miracle. But if we see, then we're missing out something important. So what we cannot overlook in this situation is the heart of Elisha. Not only the heart of Elisha. He looked at the widow in her despair. And behind Elisha's action was the heart of God. The heart full of limitless, and the heart overflowing with, and a heart that truly grieved with this widow and her pain. And this is the heart of God. Because God's love always goes downward to the low place. And God's grace always flows downward, and the broken. And God's grace flows downward to the desperate who cry out to God. Flows down, grace flows down, and mercy flows down. And it reaches us where we are. It always reaches us where we are. So we must remember this. And here's the good news. We turn to God in times there. That is when God begins work. And this is when His power goes up. And that's when the story of redemption starts to unfold through our lives. That's what we see in today's passage. So verse 2 just said, tell me, what do you have in your house? This woman, widow, there's nothing there at all, she said, except a small jar of oil. So basically saying that I got nothing with me. That was her answer. But can you hear the way her voice? Can you feel her despair? Saying, I have nothing with me. I'm desperate. Nothing with me. She looked at us, hoping that there might be something or anything she can sell, get a little bit of money to pay off, but nothing. No possessions of value, no resources left, and nothing to offer except this small olive oil. And in the Hebrew text, the phrase a jar of oil, it doesn't mean a large quantity. It means a very small, just enough oil for a single use, just a little bit of oil. That's it's very tiny, significant, almost nothing. And yet it was something that she had. So what is Elisha doing? So Elisha is asking the question, what do you have? So instead of despairing over this, Elisha is helping her shift her focus. Instead of starting at what she did have to what she still have. He points her to the little that remained. God does not point us and point to what we do not have, but God points to what we have. God does not ask for what we do not, but God does ask for what we still have, and asking us to have. Our answer would be, I got nothing with me, you know that. But He's asking us, what do you have? What do you have with you? So we need to choose. Too often our response to life is, I got nothing. I'm empty. Can't do this. I got nothing with me. He says, nothing except. The word except has to right away. Instead of saying, I've got except. But it should be, I got nothing except this little jar of olive oil. That is our living faith begins. That's where our living faith begins, when we reply, I've got nothing with me except. And this is what begins His. Because God does not ask for what we do not, but He does ask for, what do you have? And God wants you to place that little thing into His hands, and I'm going to do my miracle from what you have. And starting in verse 3, Elisha tells the widow, Elisha around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars. Don't ask for just a few. Then go in, shut the door behind you and your son. Pour oil into all the jars that you have. And she left him, the door behind her and her sons. Put the jar, and she kept pouring. When all the jars were full, she said to her son, bring me another one. But he replied, they're not left. Then the oil stopped flowing. So here the empty jar represents empty clay vessels. And it tells her, don't just collect a few. Go around the city, go in the town, collect them, get them as many as possible. So original text, the Hebrew text, phrase is called altamiti. And altamiti means make it small. Do not diminish. Make it large. Make it abundant. That's what it means. In other words, expect something big.
Something big. Don't shrink your faith. Don't limit God. That's the kind of faith God calls us to. So even when we cannot see the outcome, even when the situation seems hopeless, even though when it makes no sense at all, God invites us to expect Him to do a greater things than we can ever imagine, beyond our imagination. So in youth worship, I sometimes show a Bible study to better understand the realistic view. So we don't see every single detail from the passage, but I think this video really gives us an understanding of the situation, and not the best quality. It's the best of quality because it's God's story written in the Bible. And here I found something very, I'm not sure whether you think in the way, but Elisha, prophet, did not perform the miracle by himself. And I found it very, very interesting because why didn't Elisha just gather the jars and pour the oil and show the widow a miracle right there on the spot? But he didn't do that. He could have. Or he could have and made gold and silver right there. That's not what he did. Who performed the miracle? Of course, God did. God performed the miracle. But firsthand, the widow went outward. That's when faith becomes alive. Outward, that's when our faith becomes alive. And that's when not only us, but also people around us experience the greatness of God and lift up His name in praise. And that's what it means by let faith overflow. Let faith overflow. So faith is not something we simply hold on to, but faith is something we must live out and pour out. That's what living faith looks like. If she had kept the oil sealed inside that small jar, if she had never poured it into other empty vessels, didn't go around the city gathering all the jars, some lounge because they didn't have enough laundry machines. So I had all these clothes from our team and drove for like 10, 15 minutes to find the laundromat and then do laundries. And that's what I did in Japan mission trip. So if you're joining Japan mission trip next year, that's what you'll be doing. So thankfully, I did the boys' clothes and Elizabeth did the girls' clothes. So thankful. And we drove down the road. And I noticed something that I'd never seen before. And many feel the rural side of Japan, it's a middle. And when I was preparing and meditating today's passage, the image came back to me. These are not meant to keep the water for themselves. They are designed to overflow. They're designed to overflow the water to the lowly places, to the next field, and to the next field, and to the next field. That all may share harvest. I think I kind of get the idea, but what if I still do not have that much? What I have is so tiny that there's no way that it can overflow. That we have to remember, it is not about us, it overflows. God, who makes it overflow. Because God does not ask, sufficient. What do you have sufficient? That's not what God you in your hand. And when we place it before Him, God says, let me work from there. Let me work there. Play. God's power revealed when faith is lived out. Faith be poured out. So whenever we are and wherever we are, and that's how faith becomes alive, and that's how faith becomes overflow. So not holding on, but pouring out, and not waiting until we feel strong, but stepping forward in obedience, trusting God. And when we pour out, this emptiness becomes flow. That was my exact prayer. I said, God, I have nothing. I got nothing with me. I stepped into ministry filled with no ability, no skill. How can I to you? And what I had were something, I have something bigger. I have volunteers, I have teachers, I have shepherds, I have our church, I have parents praying so hard, supporting us. And this is my jar of oil, and they are my jars of oil given me. Gather all the jars to bring us one by one before the Lord because it is ready for His blessing because it is God who makes it overflow and pour out. After experiencing all these miracles, can lead. So I really believe that this is one of the spiritual parenting that we can see in the entire Bible. The miracle of the oil filling the empty jars was not just something the mother told her children about later, something they experienced together. This is what the widow did with her sons. She didn't send them away saying, hey, mommy's busy, mommy's doing important, I'll see you later, or I'll explain later. That's not it. She brought them in. She brought the two sons in. She told them to fetch the jars, and together they watched God's miracle unfold. In other words, they all experienced it firsthand experience of God's miracle. The mother did not tell her sons about what God had done. She let them participate. And that living faith, this living faith is the greatest. But firsthand experience of His power. And of course, it's very important to testimonies, what God did for our lives. But even greater than hearing our stories is for them to experience and have their own. For them to say, my God is my parents' God, or my God is my God. And God worked in my life, but He's working even greater way in my life. It is my God. That is a true inheritance we must pass on. A faith, a living faith. Or in a car on the way to church or before bed. She returned humbly to the man of God. What does that mean? It means she did not claim the miracle as her own possession. She acknowledged that it belonged to God. And this is the attitude we are stewards. So who experienced this miracle? The widow did. I've got two. I've got nothing except this little jar of olive oil. Whether it's your house church, your shepherds, your family, your ministry, our church, people around who are praying for us, supporting us, let's focus. Say, I've got nothing except this little olive oil. And I know that God, you are going to do your amazing things. You're cool. Together. So let us take a moment of silence to do, to hear. The school, wherever we are, how can I by faith to people around this? So let's pray and ask before the Lord.